Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Catholic Culture Podcast. My guest today is a Dominican of the Western Province. He was a professional drummer for 10 years, then joined the Dominicans and was ordained a priest in 2018. He's currently completing his doctorate in sacred theology at the Catholic University of America. Today, we're going to be talking about his book, recently published by Pontifex University Press, The Shape of the Artistic Mind, a search for the metaphysical link between art and morals in the Thought of Thomas Aquinas. And my guest's name is Father Bradley Elliott. But first, let me take a moment to share some news with you. As you probably know, this podcast is a production of CatholicCulture.org. And as it happens, 2023 has been Catholic Culture's 20th year in operation as a website. And we're also going through quite a period of transition right now. Back in 2003, Catholic Culture was founded by my father, Jeffrey Miras, and he is now in the process of retiring. He is passing the torch to me. In fact, as of this summer, I was officially made president of Trinity Communications, which is the nonprofit that runs Catholic Culture. So I'm in the process of being sort of transitioned into various leadership duties. So I'm coming into a lot more responsibility than just running this podcast network, because CatholicCulture.org we have news, we have a staff of commentary writers, we have a lot of different things going on there and have for a long time. So first of all, please pray for me as I take on this responsibility to serve the church, as my dad has done with this site for the past 2 decades. I pray for, as I often tell you, I pray for my listeners and all of our donors every day. And that also brings me to what just started, Catholic Culture's fall fundraising campaign. We've been very blessed to have some generous donors who have offered a matching challenge grant of $100,000. And so basically up until December 8th, the end of this campaign, anything you donate will be doubled up to $100,000. So this will help us to continue in the new year, 2024. I would certainly take it as a great vote of confidence in my ability to continue this apostolate that my dad founded. And I would be very, very grateful personally for anything that you can give, even a small amount, because this is the best time to do it since it'll be doubled. So thanks to everybody for your generosity in prayer, in donations. To give, you can go to CatholicCulture.org/donate/audio. Okay, on with the episode. Father Brad, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me, Thomas. It's good to be here.
Well, I wanted to ask you a little bit about your musical background because I too spent a while as a professional musician. My degree is in jazz piano, and I was playing professionally on and off for the past 10 years. And then about a year ago, sort of figured out that I'm called more to Catholic media and study and intellectual work. So, so it's sort of an interesting, similar path in that respect there.
Yeah, I had a similar path. I fell in love with drums and percussion when I was young, early on in my early teens, and decided by the time I went to college I wanted to make that my life. I studied jazz and studio music at the Cincinnati Conservatory of Music, or the University of Cincinnati College Conservatory of Music, and I got a 4-year bachelor's degree in music there. It was a fantastic experience because that was a very rigorous conservatory. A conservatory that certainly exposed me to a lot of things I would have otherwise never been exposed to as a simple jazz drummer, or at that point I did a lot of rock and roll as well. And so I was exposed in that environment to the whole spectrum of classical music and also sacred music.
Wow.
That was in many ways my first exposure to sacred music and the history thereof, which I found absolutely fascinating. And that put the original seeds in my mind, actually, of much deeper philosophy of music and the philosophy of art in general. That really kind of set my own intellectual life off on a very specific trajectory, I would say. Then finally, I did not answer the call to the priesthood until I was in my later 20s. After I got out of the conservatory, I wanted to play jazz and I wanted to be in the music industry. I actually moved to Los Angeles, California, in my early 20s after the conservatory, after my conservatory years, and I played drum set professionally in Los Angeles. I did a lot of jazz, but then also did a lot of studio session work in Los Angeles. Since I was a younger guy and I did not have a family at that time, I was able to go on the road with a lot of rock bands. So I did the touring thing for a few years as a musician, and I loved being a musician. Being a professional musician is an incredibly fulfilling career. But nonetheless, during that time, I felt that I was called to give my life in a different way, to give my life not just to the complete consecration of self in religious life, but also to complete service of the church in a more direct way. So when I was towards the end of my 27th year, early 28, I left the music industry and I entered seminary. I was with the diocese for 2 years. And then when I was 30 years old, I entered the Dominican order in the Western Dominican province in the United States, because I lived in LA at that point for years. I fell in love with the West Coast. I fell in love with California. And yeah, I was in the Western Dominican province from 30 on. At this point, I'm 44 years old. So that was 14 years ago when I entered. And it has been one of the best decisions I've ever made. It's fantastic. I absolutely love being a Dominican, not simply for the religious life and the rule of life, but also for the commitment to study. And while I was studying at our school in California, the Dominican School of Philosophy and Theology, which is in Berkeley, I had a number of very, very inspiring professors that were able to direct some of my inquiry in my love for the arts, my love for the philosophy of art and aesthetics. We were able to direct that inquiry to a very specific mode of study. For example, I started really reading the works of Boethius on music, St. Augustine on music, the early classics, the classical music tradition. And then, of course, had my mind expanded through the philosophy of St. Thomas Aquinas. And all of this fed into my inquiry into the nature of art, particularly art as a virtue. For the classics, for classical thinkers, Aristotle, and certainly for St. Thomas Aquinas, art is not just a human creation. Art is actually an intellectual virtue. It's a habit of the mind. It's a good habit of the mind by which we make things in the world, and actually we become the agent of penetrating the world around us with a share of human reason. So art is a virtue. Art's not a moral virtue. It's an intellectual virtue, but a virtue of the practical intellect, by which we form the world around us with a share of that reason that God has given us. And actually, through the intellectual virtue of art, we can become agents of beauty, real beauty in the world, real beauty, not simply agents of a kind of superficial beauty that can simply be arresting to the attention, something like that, but agents of real divine beauty in the world. And as I ended up certainly concluding more and more, this is the true agent. This is the true calling and vocation of the Christian artist, to be a real agent of divine beauty in the world. And that inspired this work, The Shape of the Artistic Mind, to delve deep into these metaphysical questions. What is the real metaphysical link between art and morals in the Christian life? And those are the questions that I wanted to answer. So.
And in looking for this link, how much were you motivated by the practical question of like the actual practical connection between art and morality, because obviously that's what a lot of people are thinking about when they talk about the two, is like, can art make us more, more moral, or does a morally better person necessarily make good art? These are questions that are, constantly answered, asked
Exactly.
in the Catholic world and outside the Catholic world. But are you really focused on that practical question, or are you more interested in this, like just this sort of the speculative contemplation of whatever links there may be?
That's a really good question, Thomas, and that's where my inquiry started. Yes, uh, I was intrigued by a lot of other philosophers that were asking this very question: Can art make us moral? Can the reception of good and the consumption of good, beautiful art make us moral people? What power does art have to actually form the soul, to form not just human personality, but also to form the soul to be good? Uh, and when I started to dive into those questions, I realized that there was actually behind that question some far more, I would say, meta questions that I kept running into. I felt that there was a deficiency in the dialogue about art and morality. There was a deficiency in this whole question in the dialogue about, does art make us moral? There was a deficiency because there were metaphysical roots to the very nature of art itself, and metaphysical roots to the human person as artist that had not yet been explored. And so what I chose to do in this book is not to directly address this question, does art make us moral, but rather ask the more meta questions about this very topic. What is the connection between the virtue of art and the moral, virtuous life? Is there a connection at all? Where in the human person is that connection? And ultimately, I will conclude, along with, of course, St. Thomas, art is a virtue. Art is not a moral virtue. Art is not a moral. So the making of good things in the world does not make us good per se. There's a distinction between art and prudence.
Mm.
So the classical philosophers would define prudence as rectoratio agibilium, so right reason applied to human action, whereas art would be defined as rectoratio factibilium, so right reason applied to things made. And the distinction then between art and morals is precisely where the good terminates. Where the good terminates. Does the good of our action terminate with us, as in the virtue of prudence? Or does the good of our action terminate in the external world, in the good of those things that we make? And although art is not per se a moral virtue, there is nonetheless a symmetry between the very structure of the human person as a moral creature, as a moral agent, and the structure of the human person as an artistic agent. So there's a symmetry in the very structure between the moral man and the artistic man that must be respected and analyzed first before we can have those tools to go on and ask the more pressing questions that people were asking at the time: is, does art make us moral? Or in what sense
Right.
does art influence human personality? My work, The Shape of the Artistic Mind, focuses much more on the underlying speculative questions, the connection between art and morals, and less directly on answering the question, does art make us moral? Ultimately, I lay the groundwork for showing that art has a very powerful, is a very powerful agent for shaping human personality. And this is why we need to be very cautious with the type of art that we make, and very cautious about the type of art that we take in.
Right.
Within film and music and literature, we must be very cautious about that, because art has this amazing reciprocal ability to not just be a form out in the world of nature, but then to influence the human soul as well. So particularly, I can think of film and music. As a film and music are two very powerful forms of art that have the ability to influence the human soul and shape the human soul. To shape the human soul to be sensitive to what is truly good, or to be sensitive, or to say, not just to be sensitive to what is evil, but to lack a sensitivity to the good. And then just descend to what is merely arresting to the lower passions, or something like that.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Jacques Maritain did talk about the similarities or analogies between the virtues of the artist and the virtues of a moral or a good man.
Hmm.
But you're going deeper to the metaphysical roots in more of like an architect. I don't know if that's the right word, but like an architectonic way or like almost a cosmic way, and looking at the really big picture and sort of like not to get too far ahead, but a lot of it has to do with the similarities between the human person as artist and God as well. And so there is this kind of like cosmic descent of imitation that
Hmm.
is traced out in great detail in the book. And maybe this would be a good time to ask. So the subtitle refers to the thought of Thomas Aquinas, but you're looking at Aquinas in two particular modes, that of his Aristotelian influence and that of his Neoplatonic influence, and trying to pay due attention to both of those. So maybe could you just sort of introduce that concept? Like what is it that you're bringing in from Aristotle? What is it that you're bringing in from the Neoplatonic tradition, and particularly Plotinus is the one that you cite
Yeah,
quite a bit in the book.
yeah, absolutely. It's a very good question. Thomas Aquinas is famous for his reintroduction of Aristotle back into Christian theology, and certainly Aquinas uses the metaphysical structure of Aristotle's four causes, the four causes of anything, in order to analyze nature, to develop a real philosophy of nature, a philosophy of nature that is fit and apt to be used to explain the gospel of Jesus and to do real Christian theology. But nonetheless, Aquinas is also known for having extensive Neoplatonic influences as well, particularly through the thought of. I focus heavily on Plotinus in the work, also because of a philosophy or metaphysics of participation, whereas all creation and the goodness within creation is seen as a participation in God's own being and a participation in God's goodness. So everything in the created world that God has made bears the fingerprint of God's likeness in some finite way.
Mm-hmm.
All creation is an imitation of the divine mind, the divine artist. So before the human creature is ever an artist, it is first God who is the supreme artist. God is the artisan of creation whose creation imitates him. And as I show in the book, the highest peak of that creation is the human person who also can be an artist in imitation of God. And the highest imitation of the divine artist is the artistic act, the human artistic act whereby the artist himself can use his virtuous mind and his skill to actually inform creation with a greater share of divine beauty, to bring creation to a greater participation in the divine beauty. And in that way, even the human artist can participate all the more in God's governance of the world.
Just a quick
It's a
side
large
question.
picture. It's a
Go
large
ahead.
picture. Mhm.
Just a quick side question. I had wondered when reading the book, where do angels come in, if at all? If at all, I mean, angels do have a share in God's governance, if I'm not mistaken, but not in a. Is there any sense in which they engage in any kind of artistic creation, or is that really just a privilege that only man has been given, despite being a lower, than the angels?
That's a yes, exactly. Angels are certainly real. The separated substances, pure intellectual essences, are real, and they have an indispensable role in God's governance of the cosmos. The whole cosmos, according to traditional Christian cosmology, is saturated with angels who play a
Right.
very important governing role over the material world. Over the material world. Uh, the angelic role is absolutely indispensable for God's governance. Nonetheless, it's the human person, particularly as both a soul and a material body together to form one thing, which is the human person. That human person sits at a unique juncture within the cosmos. whereby the human person is the lowest of spiritual creatures, but also the highest of material creatures.
Right.
Whereas the highest in one genus would match or overlap with the lowest in another genus, there is this creature called the human being, human nature, which is at one point spiritual and material. And that gives the human person a privileged location in the cosmos to not just be an agent of God's governance the way an angel would be an agent of God's governance, but to be an agent of God's governance by forming the world that he uses. Not just uses, because as material creatures, we have material bodies. We need to use the material world for our sustenance and to live. And because of that, we have a privileged role and a privileged vocation in the cosmos to actually imbue the material world with a share of beauty that bears the unique human fingerprint.
Yeah. You mentioned that, angels do govern the material world, but their knowledge is more like the mode of knowledge that God has, in that it's a simple act of knowledge.
Indeed.
Whereas our mode of knowledge proceeding through the senses is more complex and it's more commensurate with the material world. Not apologies for the listeners for relating everything to Tolkien, but it actually just made me think of the Ents in Tolkien, who are the shepherds of the trees, and the trees are sort of, because they are sort of tree-like creatures themselves, and the trees are sort of ennobled and awakened and sort of in some magical way sort of intellectualized by contact with the Ents, which is of course a kind of a similar to a big theme in your book about how human beings are able to sort of ennoble sort of the brute material reality and actually incorporate, not to bestow an intellect upon it, but to by means of what I think Maritain called like the intellectualized sense or something like that.
Yeah.
In order, we're able to bestow a certain order upon things and sort of represent it back to God in a sort of an elevated form.
Yeah, that's exactly right. We have the ability to, in a sense, humanize the world. We can humanize the world through our making and through our craft. And that humanization that goes on, as you mentioned, Thomas, it corresponds and flows from our human mode of knowing. We don't know the way angels know. we know things through all the things that come through our senses. Nothing is in the imagination and in the mind that does not first come through the senses. So we know in that mode, and then we also create in a purely human mode. So it's a truly human participation in God's governance, as opposed to an angelic. So.
Now, we're not merely elevating nature from standing above it. Of course, as artists, we're also drawing from and dependent on and imitating nature in one way or another. The main thing I remember from Aquinas from this, before reading your book, is that Maritain talks a lot about that. He says art imitates nature according to its operations, not necessarily according to its external results or its appearances. And that, in that sense, the artist is liberated from simply imitating the external, things that he sees.
Exactly.
But what else does St. Thomas have to say about art imitating nature?
Well, the artist imitates nature, but it's also important for us to understand, and this flows from Aquinas's thought, that art does not just replicate nature. That's the key. So a human imitation is not just a human replication, almost like a machine or a photograph would simply imitate or simply replicate a scene. The artist is the artistic imitation of nature. In addition to simply being a replication, it's also, in a sense, an enhancement of nature, but a perfection of nature. So art takes on a quality almost that's like grace in a certain sense. It's almost like grace, where the artist does not just imitate nature, but perfects nature and actually imbues nature with a greater share of human reason and human intentionality. and human intentionality. So the artist is not just a replicator, someone who replicates, but the artist is truly creative in this sense. The artist really creates in the sense that the artist can create new forms in matter, artistic, accidental forms in matter that did not exist before, and thus truly ennoble the world and humanize the world.
To go back to Aristotle and the Neoplatonists, let's say Plotinus, one of the most interesting parts for me was this discussion of how both Aristotle and Plotinus, in your word, redeem certain notions from Plato's conception. I think it was, if remind me if I'm incorrect, but I think you said that Aristotle redeemed the notion of nature from Plato, and that Plotinus redeemed the notion of imitation from Plato.
Yes.
So can you please talk a bit about both of those?
Well, Plato himself, following from his metaphysics, which is oftentimes called an absolute realism, Plato, in his own writings, had a suspicion of art, or had a suspicion of imitation, because for Plato, the entire natural world was already an imitation of the real. The real forms, real essences, were not in the world of our senses, were not around us, but real essences were in an ideal world, separate from the world of our senses. The world of our senses, following Plato's great analogy, his allegory of the cave, the things that we sense are already imitations of the real. So if an artist were to imitate nature, the artist would just be imitating another imitation. The artist could not be a servant of what is real. The artist and the artistic creation would be two steps removed from what is real. So Plato had a suspicion of art. He particularly had a doubt as to whether artistic imitation could actually form the human person. Of course, it could not for Plato, because, like we said, the nature which would be imitated is already an imitation. Aristotle redeems that metaphysics, and he redeems that metaphysics by adopting what philosophy calls just a moderate realist position, whereby the things of our senses, the things around us, trees, dogs, cats, monkeys, even us, ourselves, all have real essences. There are real things in the world that can know. So when my mind knows the tree, my mind is really knowing the tree. It has access to tree-ness through the senses, and that it can really abstract the real essence of the tree, which is there. And that, in that sense, Aristotle's more moderate realism was able to redeem nature by putting real essences back into nature, as opposed to Plato, who truly abstracted essences altogether. And then it wasn't until we really get to the Neoplatonic thought of Plotinus that you have a very robust notion of imitation throughout nature. So that not only are essences truly in the real world that we see, but also everything that has being, according to its mode, is a participation in the ultimate being of what for Plotinus was the one or the good. All being participates in the one good. So what Aristotle does, and I think I write this at the end of the introductory chapter, Aristotle redeems nature as something that's worthy to be imitated, and Plotinus helped redeem the notion of imitation as something that's actually worthy of an artist. So nature is something that the artistic mind can imitate, and that imitation itself can truly connect us to reality.
I haven't read Plotinus yet. I'm actually about to read the Enneads in probably January with a sort of an online seminar group that I'm in. But that was kind of a revelation to me. I had no idea that Plotinus had discussed art at all, but it turns out that he does, and has some very perceptive thoughts. I mean, he talks about, I even wrote down part of a quote from your book, that he talks about how artworks, they're not just imitating any particular thing. They're also imitating the source of all things.
Yes.
And I think this is very important in liberating the artist from a mere slavish, imitation of the external world around him. And Plotinus says, they give no bare imitation of the thing seen, but go back to the ideas from which nature derives.
Exactly.
And I'm just surprised that I've never heard about this before reading your book. It seems like a very significant way of engaging with the much better known Platonic, doctrine of forms and how that influences his view of art.
Yes, Neoplatonic thought, particularly through Plotinus, was key to the development of Western thought, and it's key to the development also of Christian theology and the Christian understanding of art. This notion of the Neoplatonic notion of emanation, so that all things, everything that's beautiful, everything that's being, is just a kind of an emanation of the one good and an imitation of the one good. This does free the artist from being a slavish replicator of nature. So when the artist actually imparts beauty into the things that he creates, this beauty itself is a participation in God's governance of the world, in God's beauty, in a beauty that is really there. And the artist, the creative artist, can truly be creative in this way.
There's also this interesting notion, I think this was from Plotinus in your book as well, that kind of the question arises, what does the artist actually add? Like, one question is like, is art higher than nature? Is it lower than nature? Is it really adding anything? Is it just kind of pointless, because what could we make that adds anything to what God has already created in nature? I had this thought before, but it seems to be in Plotinus also that of course God creates everything, God maintains everything in being. Nonetheless, the process, God is not directly creating in every detail every tree that we see, for instance. These are the result of natural processes that keep going, that God has instilled. He is not directly creating. Well, correct me if I'm wrong. He's not directly creating every tree in the way that God directly creates every human soul at the moment of conception. And so the thing from your book that I found interesting is this idea that the artist engages in a conscious participation in creation, in a way that the natural processes that create this or that instance of a natural form, of course, ultimately created by God, don't do. So this particular tree, that an artist might paint, is crafted in every detail in a way that a tree that we see out in the world is not sort of directly crafted by God, even though everything is governed by his providence.
Yes, everything is governed by God's providence. So even every leaf on every tree is governed by God's providence, God's intentional providence, and God's governance extends down to even the smallest of particular things, or else He's not God. He governs. Right. He governs all things. But when God creates a tree, for example, He creates the substantial form of the tree.
Right.
The substantial form is there, and the substantial form can be given by God. The human person, the human artist, cannot create substantial form. What the human artist can do is an imitation of God's creative act, but transposed down a metaphysical degree. So the human person can only take the substances that already exist: the wood, the brick, the stone, the clay, and then impose on those substances a new material or accidental form. Often, I know Aristotle uses the example of the shape of a sculpture. Now, this is an accidental form. I mean, if a marble statue, the substance would still be marble, but the shape of the statue would be an accidental form that imitates an idea in the artist's mind. And this
Right.
is how the metaphysical structure of participation works. Whereas every human person imitates the exemplar in God's mind, because God creates the substantial form of the human soul, the human person.
Mm-hmm.
So can the human person create an imitation in the exterior world of the exemplars in his mind, but he cannot create them substantially. He only creates accidental or artistic form, uh,
Right.
which is metaphysically transposed down. So God creates the substances. God creates the substantial form of tree and human person. Uh, the human artist imitates in a let's say, I would just say metaphysically more impoverished way, but nonetheless in a way which imitates the divine creation.
At the final chapter of the book, you talk about art as a virtue,
Mm-hmm.
and you make some very interesting comparisons both between art and prudence, which have been compared by a lot of different writers in the Thomistic tradition, Jacques
Mm-hmm.
Maritain being one of the notable examples, but also between art and the other intellectual virtues, the speculative intellectual virtues such as science. So you compare these different virtues in terms of their form, in terms of their matter, the matter which they govern. So maybe starting with art and prudence, what's the similarity between art and prudence? Well, just to set it up, you talked about this before, but the idea that art is directed to making good things outside of ourselves. It's not directed to perfecting our own natures. Whereas prudence and the moral virtues are directed inward. They're directed towards the production of a good act, but ultimately it's an act that flows from us being good persons. And so those are the distinctions that are typically made, but you make an interesting comparison in terms of their formal qualities, the way in which they govern their matter. So art and prudence have different materials, they're directed to different ends, but what's the actual similarity between them formally?
Yeah, it's a good question. Well, both art and prudence are called practical intellectual virtues, and that's important. So they're both intellectual virtues, but they're practical in the sense that the form of these virtues, both art and prudence, is a type of applied reason. They're applying reason to some matter, which is which is distinct from what the tradition would call the speculative intellectual virtues, where it's not applied reason, but it's actually received reason. So wisdom, understanding, knowledge, these speculative intellectual virtues don't apply reason, but they actually receive reason. So they actually look at the world around them and take reason in. But the practical intellectual virtues of art and prudence apply reason to matter. And the way that they differ, the reason why art and prudence differ is not formally in the fact that they are applied reason, but they differ materially in the matter that they inform with reason. And that's the distinction. For prudence, for the virtue of prudence, the matter that is informed with reason is the matter of human action. Right. So prudence informs our human action with a share of what our mind knows to be reasonable. This is prudent action. And this is why prudence is an intellectual virtue, but it's also a moral virtue. It's also numbered among the 4 moral virtues because it has moral matter. The matter of prudence, although it's an intellectual virtue, it forms the moral matter with reason. So prudence is like the art of living in a certain sense. It's the art of being a good moral person. So the acts of prudence make us good because prudence takes reason and infuses reason into our actions. Art is distinct. Art is different because art, although it's a practical intellectual virtue in that it is applied reason, it applies reason not to human action, but it applies reason to the exterior world. It actually forms matter of the exterior world with reason. So this is the distinction between art and prudence. art applies reason to matter outside the human person, and thus art is not a moral virtue itself. Because art, a person could be a good artist and still not be a moral person. For example, Aquinas uses the example of calling somebody a good robber. In what sense could we call a robber good? Well, we can call a robber good if he has the craft of robbery, the craft of bank robbing. Now, if he's a good artist at robbing banks, we can call him in one sense good because he has a good craft or a good art of robbing banks, but he's not good in the sense that he's moral, because he did not. he's merely applying his reason to external things rather than applying reason to his own action. So, formally speaking, art and prudence align in that they're applied reason, but they are materially distinct in the distinction of the matter that they inform. Now, this is a connection also between art and the other speculative intellectual virtues, particularly science or knowledge, scientia in Latin, or knowledge. Because the world, or let's say the matter, that art specifically informs with reason is also the same matter that the virtue of science understands. Mm-hmm. Is that the external world of things. So art and science are also connected in precisely this way. Because what art can do, art can inform the material world around us with a share of that reason that our speculative intellectual virtues first contemplated. And this is also the mechanism by which art becomes more than just a replication of nature, but it can be a true augmentation of nature. Because what the artist puts into the natural world, puts into the material world, is not just a share of any reason at all, but a share of his reason that was first contemplated in that world. Mm-hmm. So there's not only a connection between art and prudence, there's also then a connection between art and the speculative virtues as well. And very few scholars bring that out. I believe that's an essential connection, because I believe that connection between art and the speculative virtues is the precise connection needed to free the artist from just being a replicator of nature to being a real imitator and a augmenter of nature.
Is it actually the speculative intellect that creatively rearranges things from the artist's imagination and creates that substantial form in his that accidental form, that idea in his mind? Mm-hmm. Or is it just that I would have thought that was the virtue of art that did that, but that maybe the speculative intellect does a preliminary role in contemplating and sort of actually drawing out those forms and having the richest possible observation of those forms before art comes into play.
That's exactly right.
Okay.
Yes, that is exactly right. The actual applying of reason is always a practical movement. The application of reason, or the forming of matter according to some reason, is always a practical movement, and that's the movement of art.
And that's true even in the artist's mind, correct?
Even in the artist's mind, yes.
Okay, yeah, I think I had misunderstood what I was reading in your book. I thought you had been saying that the speculative intellect was actually creating the artistic form as well mentally.
Well, the speculative intellect is always, the termination of the speculative intellect is always knowing. Whereas the termination of the practical intellect is always making, or something doing. Either doing or making. That's the termination of the practical intellect. So,
and that doesn't mean what you do with your hands either. And it's important to point out that technique, the physical technique, is not even, from what I understand, not even part of the virtue of art, properly speaking.
That could be,
really an intellectual
like artistic craft, or just kind of artistic skill, which is an instrument that art uses.
Right.
That's an instrument that art uses. So, but also there's something called the creative imagination. So, for example, our imaginations are precisely, the imagination is not a speculative intellectual virtue. The imagination is a sensitive power. The imagination is like the storehouse for all of those phantasms that we receive from nature. Aquinas, for example, uses the example of a golden mountain. We've never seen a golden mountain. I have never seen a golden mountain, but I can imagine a golden mountain. I can create a golden mountain in my imagination because I have seen a mountain and I've seen gold. and then my imagination can kind of create this kind of
Right.
assimilation of the two in my mind, and that's a type of imaginative artistic creation in my mind. And then what
Right.
the artist does, so the artist can create in this sense, not create ex nihilo the way God can create,
Right.
but the artist can create by reforming the world with what has been contemplated.
Right.
And so there's that constant interplay between the practical virtue of art and the speculative virtues of wisdom, science, and understanding. There's this constant interplay between the two, which is the very fingerprint of the artist himself. So when we encounter a painting or a symphony, we're really encountering the fingerprint of the artist's contemplation, which is, I think it's a beautiful
Right.
reality.
Now, we were talking about how the artist is bringing inert matter into participation with the speculative intellect, and sort of making a new form that can be contemplated, even if an accidental form. How do you connect all this? You're still talking about art, which could include any work of human craft, right, throughout this whole book. How do you connect that to the fine arts in particular?
That's a good question. I touch upon this briefly in the book. Towards the end is where I kind of come to this conclusion that it's ultimately in the fine arts where the form that is created in matter is put into matter solely for the purpose of then being contemplated. Mm-hmm. Whereas the end, or as Aquinas would say, the end of all of the arts is their use. Use is the end of all. So if I were to create a home, the end of that home would be its use. Or to create a bench, the end of that bench would be its use, which would be its use. But the fine arts are particular because the end of the fine arts is precisely their beauty and the end of human contemplation. So there's this amazing interpenetration between human craft and human contemplation. And ultimately, then I conclude that creation's the highest imitation of God is the fine artist. Because the fine artist doesn't just create by taking an exemplar in his mind and putting that into matter, but he does so with the final cause of contemplating what was created. Mm-hmm. Very similar to how God in his creation has as its final cause simply God's goodness. God did not create for any other reason other than his goodness. God's goodness was the ratio of creation, was the final cause of creation. And it is the fine artist, the artist that creates merely for the beauty of his art, that then perfectly mimics a type of act of divine creation.
We said earlier that you were not trying to sketch out the practical connection between art and prudence in this book, in terms of how art might make us better, or morally, or vice versa. But what kind of avenues do you think that your exploration of this topic opens up? Like, can you offer any suggestions as to lines of thought that might be opened up by in more practical terms by this?
Yeah, I don't address I answer the question: is art moral? Is art moral? Well, the simple answer is no. The virtue of art is not a moral virtue itself,
right?
But art, particularly the arts of the beautiful, the fine arts, will form our soul to be sensitive to beauty, and they can form our soul according to a truly human mode, a truly human way. The artist is one who has a great power in this respect. The artist is given great power because we have to, as human beings, be very careful of the type of art we create and very careful of the type of art that we take in, because art can form our human sensitivities. It can form our human imagination. And it is precisely out of the storehouse of our imagination, our sensitivities, that we then act as real human agents in the world. So art is very important. Being an artist itself will not make you a moral person. Mm-hmm. It will not. Nonetheless, the artist himself has a great power and responsibility to be a moral person so that can inform his art. And that's key. Art itself will not have a causal relationship and make you moral. Nonetheless, an artist's moral virtue will inform their art and make their art better art. It'll make their art objectively better art because that art will more perfectly participate in God's governance of the world. That's how I would answer that.
Great. Would you mind saying a final word about art among these different speculative and practical virtues and kind of the privileged role that it plays? You use this phrase that art is the supreme master coordinator between man's internal and external worlds. You also talked about how art has this kind of scope, this cosmic scope that Prudence does not have, in that it has a much vaster array of materials to work with. So just talk a bit about what makes art sort of stand out in certain ways among these different virtues.
The virtue of art stands out because through the virtue of art, the entire cosmos, in a certain sense, becomes the matter within which it becomes a type of canvas for the human artist. The art in this sense has a kind of has a type of infinity, the same way that the other speculative virtues would have a type of infinity. Mm-hmm. The artist's work, the artist's ability to creatively imagine and put into matter new forms has a type of infinity. There's a type of lack of determination to the art, whereas Prudence, the matter that Prudence informs, because it's our human action and our human passions, though that matter already has a certain innate determination about it. But the artist, although all artist is always bound by the material that he uses, the forms that an artist can create have a type of infinity, and that gives the creative artist an incredible scope. There's almost an infinite horizon of possibilities for the artist's creativity to create, and that's a fantastic prospect, but it's also a fantastic responsibility for the artist. And I do call art, at the end of my reflection on the connection between art and science, call art the master coordinator between man's internal world and his external world, because that master coordination is the ability for man to take the reason that he knows in his mind and inform the world around him. And this is ultimately our human calling. This is our human calling, to really inform the world around us with a share of human reason, which participates in divine governance. Aristotle and then St. Thomas Aquinas repeats, the human person was not given speed or fur the way other animals were given to protect them, but we were given a mind and we were given hands so that we can create. We were given hands so that we can imitate nature and use nature the way that we need to use nature, not only for our own sustenance, but also to be use nature as something that can be a repository for real beauty, that can receive what is contemplated, and be an expression of human contemplation and beauty. And so that's basically my project is one of laying the groundwork for the very possibility of the moral artist. So.
And when you look at art in terms of its cosmic function, or the vocation of mankind as a whole, broadly speaking, it does seem that reintroduces a moral consideration into not the sort of the practical workings of art, but simply the obligation for man to be an artist in the broad sense of that word, that we have a specific role in the universe that we are meant to play and obligated to play to respond to God's gifts and calling, and therefore that there is a kind of a necessity to art in the cosmic sphere, even though on an individual level, the individual works of fine arts are often said to be, unnecessary or gratuitous in a certain sense. In the broad cosmic sphere, it is something that is necessary.
Yeah, in the broad cosmic sphere, especially of the human person needs the unnecessary.
Right.
We need the unnecessary because we are made for contemplation.
Yeah.
Theologically, the human person is made our end is the contemplation of divine goodness.
But also in that God has put us in a role of governance over creation as well, and therefore we have a responsibility to not just sort of leave nature wild and untamed, so to speak, but actually to respect its nature while enhancing it and refining it or ordering it.
That's exactly right. There certainly the idea of the human person as a proper steward of nature comes directly out of this understanding of art. The human person as a proper steward of nature, but one who's supposed to read nature correctly and then use nature properly.
Yeah.
So along with the human person as a fine artist, there's the human person as a steward of creation as well. Nature is not that thing we're just supposed to leave alone and let it run wild. The human person is called to be a creator. So we are called to inform creation and inform nature with reason, but we are called to do that in a moral and responsible way. So we will be held accountable for how we misuse nature as well.
Right.
That's also.
And you can look at this in terms of the art of politics as well. I mean, you could apply this to a lot.
Absolutely.
Of different
Well, politics is a practical art. It's a practical. Practical discipline. So we say political science, but technically politics is not science, it's an art. It's the art of governing polities and governing human communities according to their mode and according to what really works for their benefit and their perfection. And there's a type of stewardship and art that goes along with that as well. Yeah. So the groundwork that I try to lay in this book is a groundwork for so many major topics in human society.
Right. Because it's not just about the fine arts. And your dissertation is about Catholic social teaching. Am I right about that?
Exactly. So I'm using a lot of these insights that I gleaned from this study, The Shape of the Artistic Mind, in my current research into Catholic social teaching, particularly the way we use nature, our use of nature, our governance of nature, particularly the question of property, the relationship between the human person and nature and the material world, the relationship that we call property. What does this mean? What is it, and what are the implications there? Implications and responsibilities for the human person. So,
this is a little random, but just with the respect to the question of property, it makes me think of that. Was it Locke who talks about homesteading, or kind of the idea that you have to put your stamp on something in order to own it? I don't know if it was Locke, but there's this idea that you claim property, you claim land or nature by actually investing yourself into it and transforming it in some way, and that's the sense in which it's meaningfully your property. And so, not that we're endorsing Locke as Catholics, but just the idea that an artistic relationship with nature probably has something to do with property, and ownership as well. So.
It absolutely does. Yeah, and you're right. There's originally John Locke's fundamental theory of where property rights would come from human labor kind of mixing a type of self-ownership with the ownership of things.
Right.
And that would be the genesis of labor. That does come from Locke. And it's fine for Catholics too. I like Locke a lot. There's a lot that I'm also critiquing in John Locke in my own work.
Right.
So there's a lot that I'm critiquing about Locke, although there's a lot that I love about Locke as well.
Right.
I'm critiquing that, but you're absolutely right. I think your instinct is spot on, that a lot of the insights about art, the human artist, is also directly related to the human person's relation to matter, the relation to creation that we call property or artist or all of these things. So these all of these topics are all connected because they're connected in the human person's relation to the world.
Right.
How does the human person as a rational agent actually relate to the world? It's a very complex relation, but it's a relation that has necessary corollaries, like art, like property, all of these things.
All right. Well, Father Brad, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Thomas. God bless you. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
All right, everybody. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.
The Catholic Culture Podcast is a production of CatholicCulture.org. Check out our other podcasts, including Way of the Fathers, an early church history podcast hosted by Mike Aquilina, Catholic Culture audiobooks bringing to life classic Catholic writings, and Criteria, the Catholic Film Podcast, featuring deep analysis of great films from a Catholic perspective. You'll find all of this, as well as Catholic news, commentary, liturgical year resources, and much more at CatholicCulture.org.